heartiest thanks to you and your center who have given me this opportunity to contribute my research as far as our topic is concerned, that is a violation of human rights in Kashmir, glancing through the humanitarian prism. In order to start off with this particular topic, which is extremely important now today that we mark the first anniversary of revocation of Article 370 and 35A back in 2019. It's been a year, and Kashmir remains in a lockdown. So my preliminary research that I conducted as part of my PhD thesis was on colonial and post-colonial narratives to understand post-colonial societies such as that of Pakistan and India. And to my utmost knowledge that I can apply to this particular topic is that in order to understand a little bit of historical background into the issue of Kashmir and rights violation here, we have to really look into the colonial dimension, because if we just bypass the colonial dimension, I'm afraid we will be really risking a lot. So the way to look forward towards understanding the root cause of this, discrepancy, which is done by India within, constitutional revocation, is to look at post-colonial India as a colonizing power. So what is it doing with regard to Kashmir has to do very much of the post-colonial legacy that India is actually, exercising. And with this, I would just try to a little bit apply the perspective of post-colonial theory, because I think that theory making contributes a lot in the field of social sciences, and particularly in the field of international relations. So I would be a little bit more interested in sort of, looking at the post-colonial theoretical dimension into understanding of the nature of this issue. I would also like to talk a little bit about how Elaf illustrated in terms of how the Rawlsian theory into political liberalism would envisage rights debate in Kashmir. And then, of course, from liberal perspective, liberal left perspective, as enunciated by 20th century writers and philosophers like Antonio Gramsci, who talks about the idea of hegemony, who is a hegemon, and the idea of counter-hegemony, how the hegemon is able to actually use coercive power, or use the element of violence and force to sort of practice these kind of political imagination, and the way in which a counter narrative to it in terms of how counter hegemony is developed in the process of it. So I see this also within the neo-Gramscian idea of subaltern studies, which is also part of post-colonial studies literature. And then I see like the idea of Indian hegemony as post-colonial colonization, and counter hegemony as what we see in Kashmir as a social movement, a movement of national self-liberation and that of self-determination of Kashmiris. Then, of course, I would also be interested in looking at it from the paradigm of Edward Said, who is a half Palestinian, half American political theorist. And Edward Said's theory about the idea of giving a European and a non-European narrative to understand nature of post-colonial societies is important, because the idea of colonization of South Asia, the idea of this kind of demarcation between how the colonial powers actually brought in their institutions, and in our case, the British, how they demarcated the borders, how they just, did the cartography, how in this case where, Cyril Redcliffe actually distributed the territorial units in a very hastily fashion. So I think that a little bit perspective into political theory and post-colonial theoretical perspective. Then, of course, my entire focus rests on finding a ground to understand the rights debate on Kashmir within a very moral and legal, philosophical angle. And in this, I also inculcate again John Rawls' idea about the law of the people, which Rawls illustrate as some general principles that could be accepted by both liberal and non-liberal society for regulating their behavior towards each other. It is Rawls' most detailed account of how a modern constitutional democracy could be viewed legitimate by reasonable citizens, who on religious, philosophical, or religious ground do not accept a liberal, comprehensive doctrine. So, what do we actually infer from it? That based on such an assumption, a democracy like that of India, can it really ensure what it fulfills or not? Or to what extent it is able to cater to the needs of its own citizens. Now, if we look at some of the human rights declarations that have been proclaimed by the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights law, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. In order to discuss briefly about what constitutes civil rights and civil liberties, I will try to give a brief view of these concepts. What do we mean by civil rights? So Encyclopedia Britannica defines civil rights as: civil rights are guarantees of equal social opportunities and equal protection under the law, regardless of race, religion, or other personal characteristics. Example of civil rights include the right to vote, the right to a fair trial, the right to government services, the right to a public education, and the right to use public facilities. Civil rights are an essential component of democracy. When individuals are being denied opportunities to participate in political society, they are being denied their civil rights. Civil rights and political rights form the original and main part of international humanitarian rights. According to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, economic, social, and cultural rights comprise the first generational rights. While civil rights are defined above, it is also important to discuss the concept of civil liberties. Civil liberties may include the freedom of conscience, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to security and liberty, freedom of speech, the right to privacy, the right to equal treatment under the law and due process, the right to a fair trial, and the right to life. Other civil liberties include the right to own property, the right to defend oneself, and the right to bodily integrity. India and its track record of fundamental rights. In the case of India, the fundamental rights embodied in Part 3 of the Indian Constitution guarantee liberties, such as all Indians can lead their lives in peace as citizens of India. And the 6 fundamental rights are right to equality, right to freedom, the right against exploitation, the right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, and a right to constitutional remedies. Now, a contradiction to its own constitution, when India actually proclaimed Article 370 and 35A, that we are able to say that there are severe lacunas that exist in Article 14 of the Indian Constitution on the question of protection and security of its citizens against any infringement of freedom of speech, right of speech, and freedom of assembly, as the case of Kashmir evidently shows. And one case in point is the AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Power Act, which has been imposed in Kashmir since 1990. The act renders emergency powers in disturbed areas and is a carte blanche to Indian border security and armed forces to murder, assault, use force, torture, inflict severe violence, and arrest without a warrant. Till date, no Indian Army officer is prosecuted for their heinous crimes in Kashmir. By promulgating such acts, India is clearly violating Article 4, 6, and 7 of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as Article 3 of the 4th Geneva Convention, by squashing Kashmiris of the right to life, using torture, sexual violence, massacres, extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and mass graves. India's abrogation of Article 370 and 35A in Kashmir is a loud reminder that far from practicing its own constitution, it has violated norms of international law. On 5th August 2019, India belligerently took over the disputed and autonomous region of Kashmir, stripping off its autonomy by merging with the Union territory. The legal fraternity in India called it extra-constitutional, fraudulent, and illegal, barring the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly, making it entirely dysfunctional and abrogating it altogether. Article 370 of the Indian Constitution gives special status to Jammu and Kashmir, allowing it to have a separate constitution, a state flag, and autonomy over internal administration of the state. This article, along with Article 35A, defined that the Jammu and Kashmir state's residents live under a separate set of laws, including those related to citizenship, ownership of property, and fundamental rights as compared to residents of the other Indian states. As a result of this provision, Indian citizens from other states could not purchase land or property in Jammu and Kashmir. It is important also to see Article 370 in the light of Clause 7 of the Instrument of Accession signed by Maharaja Hari Singh, that declared that the state could not be compelled to accept any future constitution of India. The state was within its right to draft its own constitution and to decide for itself what additional powers to extend to the central government. Article 370 was designed to protect those rights, actually. According to the constitutional scholar A.G. Noorani, Article 370 records a solemn compact. Neither India nor the state can unilaterally amend or abrogate it. Internal discontent with Article 370 grew like wildfire. P. Chidambaram, a senior leader in the opposition Congress party, described the decision as a catastrophic step. Many legal experts in India saw the move as extra-constitutional and opined that the central government was in blatant violation of Instrument of Accession and that it cannot arbitrarily downgrade the status of state of the Union territory. Therefore, the argument surrounding the justification for the illegality of Article 370 is that if the act or the status of the state of Instrument of Accession was not acceptable, then why was it allowed to be part of the Indian Constitution for unexplainable years? This is a violation of the fundamental rights of the state and its people. This act is without justification of any legal, economic, or political grounds, which alone attracts violation of the constitutional rights and invites judicial review of the Supreme Court, that is the Indian Supreme Court. Pakistan, in its capacity, was quick to respond to India's move in Kashmir as illegitimate, illegal, and denounced that it was an internal matter of India. Pakistan believes that Kashmir is a disputed area and that under the United Nations resolution, Kashmiris be given the right of national self-determination and that no unilateral action in Kashmir should be acceptable to Pakistan. Furthermore, Pakistan believes that Kashmir is the unfinished agenda of partition and that any change in the territorial status of Kashmir is an infringement on its demography and a violation of territorial jurisdiction by India. Pakistan justifies that India made an illegal and unilateral attempt to hijack Kashmir by revocation of Article 370 and 35A. In this respect, according to Pakistan, the issue of conflictual status of Jammu and Kashmir is recognized by the United Nations Charter and especially the international community. In line with Pakistan's call to urge the international community to stick to United Nations resolution on Kashmir, the United Nations General Assembly was called to address this issue. After nearly 55 years, Pakistan's efforts were claimed as a diplomatic victory, for it was successful to convene the United Nations meeting with the good offices of China And then Kashmir was again on the UN agenda in spite of the Indian reluctance to bring it to the UN forum. Pakistan remained firm and focused in its policy on Kashmir and asserted that it is not the internal matter of India. It is a matter of world peace and security, which has come under the debate within the UN ambit after 1965. Narendra Modi and his fascist policies have set the precedent for a mass-scale ethnic cleansing and even a probability of a genocide, considering the possibility that the region will become majoritarian Hindu, ripping off Kashmiris from their Muslim majoritarian status. With Article 370 gone, Kashmiris would not be able to exercise the right to own a property. As a result, will lose the right of inheritance of land and kinship. In other words, Kashmiris, like the Palestinians, will be deprived of the land which they once owned, and thus resulting in their marginalization, ghettoization in political, economic, and social domains. India deployed 900,000 troops, one of the largest deployment of its military contingents ever in Kashmir, blocked and banned all communication links, incarcerated and detained the political leadership of Kashmir, imposed unlimited curfew, curbed the basic human rights of millions of people in Kashmir by making it one of the largest human prisons of the world. At its worst, schools, colleges, universities, and all seats of learning were closed. Hospitals recording extreme emergency with severe limitations of medical supplies, maternity wards having almost absent mid-nurses, casualty wards having next to zero rescue staffs. The world watched the most hapless scenes of how one of the biggest democracy kept its population at hostage. Of late, India has suffered the largest decline in its political rights and civil liberties record. In its 2020 report published by pro-democracy nonprofit Freedom House, based in Washington, D.C., gives a damning assessment of Modi's government's pattern of Hindu nationalist policies, including the persecution of religious minorities, abruptly revoking Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy, the adoption of the Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA or CAB, which it calls a discriminatory citizenship law, and the aggressive suppression of the anti-CAA protests that followed eventually. India has come under sharp international pressure following Modi government's revocation of J&K special constitutional status and the passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which critics say make religion the basis of granting Indian citizenship and discriminate against the Muslims. Rights organizations have also raised vociferous criticism against India. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, filed an application before India's Supreme Court asking that the United Nations be made a third party in the petition that has been filed against the Citizenship Amendment Act. Moreover, Antonio Guterres defended the right of self-determination of Kashmiris under international law and promised that the right of self-determination of Kashmiris should be protected. He was the first Secretary General of the UN to talk freely on Kashmir till date. While Kashmir remains in a lockdown, there is a great desire of the people of Kashmir in the liberation movement. The spirit of the people of Kashmir remain high and resolute. No one can deny them the freedom from the barbaric Indian occupation. It is a grim reality, nevertheless, that more Indians are living abroad in shame as never before. When the famous Indian author and writer Amartya Sen wrote his book, The Argumentative Indian, it was believed that Indians put reason and argument behind any social discourse. But the new face of the reality is that today many Indians in the West became apologetic and least argumentative for the follies of their own government. Scholars and writers like Amartya Sen himself opposed the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, directly, saying that he criticizes the government and said that as an Indian, I am not proud of the fact that India, after having done so much to achieve a democratic norm in the world, where India was the first non-democratic country to go for democracy, that we lose that reputation on the grounds of action that have been taken. He regarded the detention of Kashmiri political leaders as a classical colonial excuse, something that I was also discussing about, to prevent backlash against the Indian government's decision, and called for a democratic solution that would involve the Kashmiri people, the will of the Kashmiri people. Arundhati Roy, a famous Indian activist and celebrated writer, while addressing huge crowds in the United States, commented on the fate of the Kashmiris as saying that Indian Muslims have been effectively disenfranchised and are becoming that most vulnerable of people, a community without political representation and without a voice. Various forms of undeclared social boycotts are pushing them down the socio-economic ladder, and for reasons of physical security, into ghettos. Indian Muslims have also lost their place in the mainstream Indian media. A conquest, a colonial annexation, another triumph for Hindu nation was being celebrated. Once again, the conqueror's eyes fell upon the two primal trophies of conquest, women and land. Statements by senior BJP politicians in patriotic pop videos that notched up millions of videos legitimize this indecency. Google Trends showed a surge in searches, marry a Kashmiri girl and buy land in Kashmir. The face of Indian Confederation actually is bare naked today. Through the illegal annexation of Kashmir, NRC, the National Registration of Citizens, and the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, there is an uproar and social and political discontentment across the country. The country has, in fact, fragmented along the political and religious lines. Separatist movements are gaining strength in Mizoram, Tripura, and Nagaland. The general impression and the ground reality, in fact, is that the RSS has saffronized India, its institutions, its military, its educational institutions, even its armed forces. In educational institutions, there is a deep rift as the BJP tries to exploit the religious card. In Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, a Kashmiri student was attacked and the Hindu Mahasabha applauded that. The ideology of Hindutva is decapacitating the Indian state. Conclusion. So where do we go from here? Democracy in India has been a hostage to the ideological narrative of the BJP that plans to create the Hindu Rashtra or Hindu Reich. India is today passing from a deep worsening of the idea of freedom, right, and its appeal globally is diminishing very sharply. Modi's actions in Kashmir is tantamount to a genocide, where millions of Kashmiris are put to complete lockdown with no connectivity whatsoever with the outside world. As the situation of violations of human rights gets worse, alas, the world should no longer be mum over the huge brutality perpetrated on Kashmiris, and time has come to demand the criminal prosecution against Narendra Modi, such as what was also suggested by our Prime Minister Imran Khan in his United Nations General Assembly speech, along with his Saffron Brigade. And the debate is that if Slobodan Milosevic could be actually prosecuted within the International Criminal Court, then why can't be Modi? Kashmiris are fighting their own indigenous struggle and there is no backing off for them. It's time for India to realize that the floodgates of doom are near, as what happens in Kashmir will be a reflection, the horror that could actually unleash in its most restive parts. And in the end, I would like to just present one of the dedications that I have written on Kashmir, which goes like, Kashmir, oh Kashmir, we know that you are long aggrieved. We know that your agony is nerve-wracking. Our hearts sigh with pain and sorrow. Our deepest, utmost desire is to see you free. The freedom that is your destiny, the freedom that is your freedom. Your resolve, your acute blistering wounds, your aspirations shall never ever go in vain. Those that tread you on the gates of hell, those that agonized, traumatized, brutalized you shall one day be bent in shame. Those that unleashed horrors on your sacred land shall redeem with their knees, bent in repentance. Your cry, your deepest wish for liberation will bear fruit one day, inshallah. The day of your resurrection is not far. Your yearnings for your lost glory, your magnificent dominion shall resuscitate on the beloved land of Kashmir. Your people, you epitomize your honor. Your heads shall stand in honoring every drop of blood. Every single sigh, every single scream of terror shall, inshallah, be recompensed. The day is not far when your lush green valleys, your lakes, your mountains retain the exuberance of heavens. Kashmir, oh Kashmir, you are just very near to be back as the paradise gained. Kashmir, oh Kashmir, yes, your land shall resonate, hope and